Everybody, old school comic book reviews. Okay, this is a follow up to another video I did really recently. I guess this would be the addendum or the redo, or I'm probably using those words wrong. But anyway, I just did a video about the Bronze Age of comics. It was a response to BK Critics' video about, what's your favorite age in comics. And he picked the Silver Age, and he put it out there for anybody else who wanted to do a video, and I thought it was really cool. So I did one about the Bronze Age. My original one was very, very, very long and very, very rambling. And the tape that I ended up using, I really wanted to get in stuff about, different formats and different other companies and things like that that appeared during the time period. And I realized when I got to the end of it, I didn't talk about half of the more, major things that were going on. So this is kind of sort of a corrective or sort of an addition to that video. Okay. So anyway, the Bronze Age of comics is roughly, early 70s to about the mid 80s or so. And what you saw then was, things changing, kind of changing with society, changing with the times, different things going on in industry and things like that. I'm probably going to repeat myself a little bit from what I said in the other one, but, I hope you'll bear with me. One really interesting thing, there's a few interesting things going on. Well, let's start here. You had what was going on at DC Comics. Marvel had really kind of knocked DC to the side a little bit as far as doing exciting superhero comics. They really were able to capture the imagination of the readers and things, okay? DC was still hanging in there. But I'd say one of the higher points that most people point out to, obviously, of course, the Green Lantern, Green Arrow comics by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. And also at the same time, there was a whole sort of I don't know if I want to say reimagining of Batman, but the whole idea of bringing him back towards his kind of pulp roots and making the character a mysterious figure of the night. Batman is solo. He's out in the darkness. He's solving murders and crime. The focus on Batman as a crime fighter as opposed to back in the 60s being a campy superhero, or the 50s being this children's character that fought Venus flytraps from outer space and big head green Martians and things like that. This is Batman in the city, on the streets, things like that. The whole idea of making the Joker a homicidal maniac, that came about at this time of period. Making the big flowing cape, the mysterious elongated ears, and all that. That happened at this period. DC did a lot of other interesting things too. Aside from the superhero comics, they had those great Joe Kubert war comics. They still had their horror line going on. One interesting thing is Jack Kirby, who co-created all those great Marvel characters with Stan Lee in the 60s, quit Marvel and went to DC and came up with tons of comics and ideas and things for them. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with what they call Jack Kirby's Fourth World. That's all that New Gods and Apocalypse and Dark Side stuff. I mean, DC is still getting mileage out of those ideas. I mean, some of the dialogue is kind of stiff and tilted, but when it comes to just crazy far out ideas, you just cannot beat this stuff. And he did other comics too. He did Commandy, the original version of OMAC. He created the Demon, and just Jack Kirby is just such a wealth of just ideas and crazy concepts and things like that. His influence can never be underestimated. I think both companies, both Marvel and DC, were trying to expand their line a little bit. So, they're coming out with new comics, new things. They're being influenced by stuff that's going on in movies and TVs. They're doing more comics featuring, women and minorities and things like that. Exploitation things. and that's not necessarily a horrible thing. You know what I mean? It shows a willingness to be open to well, what does the public like? Let's see if we can do that. And you give the people what they want. And of course, I think I mentioned in my other tape, you've got all these other companies doing their science fiction comics, doing their horror comics, and Marvel and DC saw that and replicated in smaller ways. I don't think DC had a special line, but I know for a fact that Marvel had their black and white line that was a direct imitation of the stuff that was going on with Creepy and Eerie, and there was Mad Magazine that was out there. Marvel did a comic called Crazy, and so on and so forth. I think well, one thing, let's talk about the X-Men. The X-Men probably debuted around 75, 74, whatever. And I'm not sure if people realize this today, but it wasn't like an instant hit at all. When that comic book, when they revived that comic book, it was like a bi-monthly comic book, and it was a very slow process to it becoming popular. I mean, I remember reading an interview with like Chris Claremont where he was like, yeah, we were able to like change things and grow and have the comic build because, everybody in the office, he meant, pretty much ignored them. He's like, when it didn't get until we got to the death of the Phoenix, we are actually told we could or couldn't do something. For like 5 years, we were able to do whatever we want. And I think that's excuse me, I think that's very interesting just in the sense that here was a chance for them to do, it's superhero comics. It's not really particularly avant-garde or anything like that. It's just fun superhero comics, but they were able to do it in a slightly different way and have people become engaged and interested in it by bringing in that level of having characters that weren't stereotypes but were distinctive personalities, and then they had their changing relationships, and this person's in love with this person and that person hates that other person, and then gradually growing and the characters learning to work with each other and they're forming bonds and things like that, and the audience is forming bonds with these characters, you know what I mean? Getting back to the Death of the Phoenix, you got to remember. Well, I don't know. I don't know if people know this, but there was the original ending of that story, and they actually did it. And I think at one point they actually published the alternative ending. But the original ending, Jean Grey was supposed to live. But what happened was Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief at that time, was like, well, no, Jean has, as Dark Phoenix, she's done some horrible things. She's killed people. If we let her live, if we just let her go, that's what he said. If we just let her go, it sends out a bad message, And after going back and forth between, Claremont and the other editors and so on and so forth, they finally said, well, okay, well, you know what, we'll kill her, But if we kill her, we're treated as a serious thing, we're not going to just bring her back in a few months or whatever. And that was something that was very new and very different and very shocking in the sense that you had one of the major characters die and they were dead, and it was treated as a real death, I think I mentioned, in the other tape, about Spider-Man, the death of Gwen Stacy, the character died off, and, they didn't really bring her back or anything, and it was a very tragic thing. But, that just really wasn't that typical in superhero comics at that time. And the character was dead for a few years at least, they brought her back for X Factor or whatever, but that's a whole another story. Going back again, during the Bronze Age, I think the companies, Marvel, DC, or whomever, were just a little bit more willing to take a chance on things. They might have been, following trends or whatever, but at least there was an awareness of the world outside of, comics fandom, obviously, well, not so much obviously, but, there was an attempt to do, let's try this. I know Marvel put out one comic book called The Human Fly that was based on some stunt performer. They had that Godzilla comic book. Of course, they did the first, the original, Star Wars adaptations, and me personally, I think that's great. I think that's good. I think that shows the company's trying to get more people from the outside into comics as opposed to trying to get more money out of the few people that are into it. So there's lots of adaptations going on. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work, but that's fine. Going back to the X-Men, Marvel had pretty much overtaken, DC Comics, at this point, and DC's only, good selling comic book was like the New Teen Titans. It would be like the X-Men would be the number one comic, and the Titans were number two. But aside from the Titans, no other comics were really selling, and you can see how those kind of comics were, they weren't rip-offs. The Titans weren't really a rip-off of the X-Men, but you can see how they were hitting some of those same sort of buttons where you have, once again, characters that were thought of as kind of second rate, but given, distinctive personalities, and bringing in that soap opera thing where, once again, it's the evolving friendships, the evolving romantic relationships. You get the fantasy stuff with characters like, Starfire and her background, contrasting and comparing to, say, the background of somebody like the Wally West Kid Flash, who, says on the page, hey, you know what, I love my parents, I'm a Midwestern conservative, and I'm not ashamed of that, and and at the same time willing to take on certain, social issues and things like that. And that's another, I think, characteristic of those kind of quote-unquote Bronze Age superhero comics, where, of course, you still got alien invaders, you still got mad scientists, you still got supervillains, but occasionally there was an attempt within that framework to tell the occasionally more poignant story, or the more dramatic story, or the more socially conscious story, what else was I going to say? Frank Miller, I didn't bring him up too much in the last tape, but Frank Miller's influence can't be underestimated. Of course, he kind of changed Daredevil up by bringing in, of course, the film noir stuff and the crime stuff, and the level of violence that was he kind of surpassed what people were used to seeing in superhero comics at that time. But even more, or as much as that, or I'll say even more than that, just the way that he approached comic book storytelling. I think he kind of like, he changed the game. A lot of people talk about, widescreen comics and things like that, but I think even 20 years ago, Frank was able to bring a certain level of cinematic comic book storytelling, bringing in his influences from guys like, Will Eisner. I would say Neil Adams to an extent. You could definitely see like Gil Kane and his like early work he was doing there. There's a little bit of Jack Kirby in there too towards the end, and bringing in other stuff too, samurai comics and stuff like that, and just the way that the stories were paced, the way they were told visually, a lot of times in hacked out comics, there would be some caption or some dialogue describing the action that some character was doing. But instead, when Frank took over, instead of having Matt Murdock walk across the room and then have him have a thought balloon saying, well, here I am, we're walking across the room now, he just got rid of it, he would just show Matt Murdock walking across the room and use whatever dialogue. Actually, a lot of times he wouldn't have dialogue in there. Just let the story, just let the visuals tell the story. And I think that made a huge impact. And his comics were very provocative, just in the, just on the storytelling level, and of course, as far as the story content was concerned. And that kind of leads over to how you started getting stuff like The Punisher. I remember that first Punisher miniseries. I think the writer was Stephen Grant, and the art was Mark Zek. But reading it, that comic book felt just like, it felt like an action movie. It felt like an action revenge movie that you would go to the show and see with like Steven Seagal or Schwarzenegger or anybody like that. And And that was great because I think that's why it was a success. I think because it kind of tapped into the zeitgeist of what people wanted to see. For good or for bad, you could say how that comic, along, of course, with like Dark Knight and Watchmen and whatever, kind of ushered in the whole grim and gritty phase. And you know what? That's a whole nother tape. But anyway, but that's just I think a lot of stuff that I kind of like left out of the other one, the other tape. But all this stuff was going on along with the new formats, along with the rise of the independent companies. Marvel did their version. It really wasn't. It's not an independent company if Marvel was putting it out, but they had a line where creators could own the characters and get royalties. Production values. For comics went up, and I think that was just a really exciting thing where you had towards the beginning kind of slow incremental changes toward the beginning of that era. This is what I want to say. Toward the beginning of the Bronze Age, you had these kind of slow incremental changes, and then toward the end, you had these kind of like one thing after the other. You could bring in. I would even bring in the whole thing of. I didn't even mention crossovers. The Bronze Age was the kind of start of the intercompany crossovers, and I don't know if a lot of people know this. The first Marvel DC team up was not Superman meets Spider-Man. It was actually they did an adaptation of the Wizard of Oz movie, and then right after that came the Superman Spider-Man thing. But you had that. Then you had, of course, they did a sequel. Then you had Batman meets the Hulk. Then you had the X-Men meets Teen Titans. Around that time, they were actually supposed to do the Avengers meet the Justice League of America, but it fell apart because of company politics and stuff like that. And of course, you had kind of the dawn of what we call, event comics with Secret Wars and Secret Wars 2 and Crisis on Infinite Earths. And this is just me being an old, grumpy old man. The way they did it then is the way I think they should do it. You have your event comic, you have that title, and then it just kind of has one or two crossovers with the pertinent issue or with the pertinent titles, for like one or two issues, and then that's it. Getting off topic, I hate the way they do it now where you've got the event, then you've got the tie-in to the event, then you've got the supplement to the event, then you've got the crossovers, then you've got the tie-ins, then you've got the spin-offs, then you've got other comics that have nothing to do with the event, but they've got the event title banner across it because somebody's trying to trick you into buying, these other comics. And, at the end of the day, it looks like you have to buy 30 extra comics or whatever, and I'm not lying about that. There will be 30 Siege comics or 30 Dark Reign comics. I just can't stand it. But anyway, that's me being a grumpy old man. All right. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I gotta thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry this was kind of loose and rambling and so on and so forth. But I hope you enjoyed it. Anybody, leave any comments, tell me what you think I left out or anything like that. Thanks, and you have a great day.